Glenn Packiam. Welcome back to the Beyond Sunday podcast, friend. How are you today?
Oh, David, man, so good to talk to you again. I'm doing well, bro. Thank you.
Oh man, I'm thrilled to chat. Really been loving your book.
Mm.
So I've been reading it, but also listening to the audiobook, which I must say, your recording of the audio version is exceptional. What was that
Ah,
like recording the audio version of your book? Is that a challenging process?
it's funny. I've had the opportunity to do it for the last few of my books, and I would like to think, David, that my years of music studio experience helped me. But the engineers are always like a little taken aback at how, because anyway, whatever. I enjoy it. It goes well. It's a fun experience. I feel maybe it's just there's a muscle memory of being with a microphone in front of you in the studio, and it's a lot easier to talk than to stay on pitch. I'll tell you that.
Very true. When was the last time you were in a studio singing?
Boy, that's a good question. Probably 10 years ago. Probably 10 years ago
Okay.
on like a New Life worship album. Probably, yeah, 2015. My guess is something like that. 2014, 2015. That's a long time ago.
Do you
I've
see
been
that in your
writing.
future? Do you see that in your
Ah,
future at all, doing that again, or you've moved on?
I have so much admiration for the people who are creating art and music and recording. I mean, it's the game is more complex and more complicated. So I admire that. I don't think I'll ever record music again. I still try to write songs, and I'm always grateful when I get to sit down in some writing sessions. We've got some talented writers here in the church and around Orange County, so I get to sit in on some of those writing sessions, and that is fun. But no, I have no no aspirations of recording anymore.
That's amazing. Well, at least you're still kind of keeping the writing muscle active and
Yeah,
alive. That's a good thing.
yeah, yeah.
Um, so, Glenn, I want to ask you why did you write this book? What is a Christian anyway? I mean, was there a particular catalytic event
Mm,
that inspired this, or
mm,
is it kind of just your response to the challenges of being a pastor in the
mm.
21st century?
I mean, I think the answer is both and, but in some
Yeah.
ways, in hindsight, I think this book has been brewing for 10 years. And actually, when I look back at my notes, I use Evernote and I keep, I just jot down ideas, outlines for, a sermon series or a book, whatever. And this has been in my notebook for 10 years. So in some ways, it has been cooking for a while. In another sense, David, there was a real urgency to it because pastorally, I was having so many conversations with people who were saying, Glenn, I'm done. I'm ready to walk away. I'm not sure if I can believe in any of this stuff. And, if given the opportunity, the conversation would go a little bit deeper. And I would say, man, tell me some of the things that you're frustrated by or disillusioned about. And oftentimes we would get to a place where I'd say, man, tell me about the faith that you're leaving because chances are it's not Christianity anyway. Chances are what you're reacting to is some sort of corruption or co-opted version of the American iteration of Christianity. And so the reason this book had been cooking for 10 years is, where I was previously in Colorado, that church had been through a pretty gnarly scandal from the founding senior pastor way back in 2006.
Yep.
And in the few years after that scandal, I began, switching from worship leading to teaching. I had the Sunday night service. And we started to use the Nicene Creed as this confession that we just say weekly in worship. And I began to see the lights come on for people because in a moment where they didn't know who to trust, in a moment where I couldn't stand up and go, well, the other guy had it wrong, but you can trust me. I could feel the eyes rolling. The creed was a way of saying, no, 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 no. This faith is bigger than a person. This faith is bigger than a church. This faith is bigger than us. And so that was the first kind of aha moment of in the wake of that. But then coming out to California, there's another kind of challenge culturally that is, honestly, it's in a lot of our country, but I really feel it out here in a pronounced way, and that is this wind of kind of confusion, where it's a create your own spirituality. Yeah, people are very spiritually open, and they like a little bit of Jesus, and they might have a worship experience with the divine or the spiritual. But then they're like, yeah, but I also love my magic candles and my crystals and my Buddhist stuff, and so there was kind of this need to go, okay, not just a trust, who can I trust, but also what is actually true. And so trustworthiness and truthfulness kind of come together for me in the creed. And I did a series on the creed out here. And that's when the lights began to come on as well at Rock Harbor, where people go, okay, this is the core of what it means to be a Christian.
Yeah, the book, Glenn, it's kind of like a systematic theology for everyday people, which I
Mm,
love. You know,
mm.
someone that's not going to read Wayne Grudem or Karl Barth
Yeah.
or something,
Yeah,
they can
yeah,
pick up
yeah.
this book and be like,
Yeah.
this is what we believe, right? And
Yeah.
it's entertaining. It's not too long. Um, on the topic of creeds, Glenn, so I grew up in a tradition where I never heard about creeds.
Yeah.
In some ways, it was almost viewed negatively
Mm,
as maybe sort of connected with Catholicism or dead religion. And
mm.
it was more about a relationship with Jesus and experience. And what I love about your story, Glenn, is you sort of live in both of these worlds of
Mm.
charismatic evangelical Christianity, but you're also an Anglican priest, and you grew up in the Anglican church, and so
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
sort of able to objectively step back and pull the best out of various traditions.
Mm.
But I think a lot of people struggle with that. Can you talk
Yeah.
about how we can apply different movements and traditions in our churches?
Yeah, I mean, it is true. I mean, I kind of grew up like, I'm a spiritual or ecclesial mutt in some ways. Like my mom came from a few generations of Anglican Christianity, which is, if people are less familiar with it, it's Protestant in its theology, but very liturgical in its practice and worship. Prayer book and communion each week. But early on into their marriage and into our family life, my parents started getting discipled by a Baptist pastor. They would attend this midweek Bible study. And then they got introduced to the gifts of the Spirit. And so I grew up, the latter part of my childhood years and teenage years were in a very charismatic Pentecostal church in Malaysia. And so I think about the gifts of various streams of the church, and I'm really grateful for it. I think the charismatics, they really help us believe that God is here, that God is speaking, that God is active, that God is not distant, that God is close. But I think the evangelicals in its sort of classical sense remind us that the Word of God is our anchor, and ultimately, we don't drift into mysticism because we have this anchor of the Scriptures. But then I think the liturgical or sacramental traditions, they really help us know that spirituality isn't always loud and expressive. It isn't always emotional and experiential. Sometimes spirituality is quiet and faithful. Sometimes it's just about consistency. It's about praying these words, regardless of whether or not we feel something. And honestly, over the course, I've been in local church ministry for 25 years this summer, and I think of the times when I was, leading people in really kind of loud worship environments. That was great. I still love those moments, and that is a lot like our Rock Harbor weekends. But
Yep.
personally, I needed a drink from the well, if you will, in a different way. And so I think people who've been at this a long time, if you only have one mode of encountering God, it will run dry. It's just the course of life. It just happens. And if that's your only mode of connecting with God, chances are you'll become disillusioned and you'll start attacking that mode. And I think that's what happens to people. And they start going, "Oh, it's modern worship, blah blah blah." You go, "Listen, modern worship is what it is. Maybe you should resource from the ancient tradition a little bit and see how that could add this, balanced diet, if you will, to your maturation process."
Yeah, that's so balanced and so very helpful. Here's a tension that I'm seeing, Glenn, is uh, worship pastors or staff pastors might be getting some interest in more contemplative practices,
Mm,
liturgical traditions, but they're in an environment
mm,
where it's not practiced.
mm.
How would you recommend a worship pastor maybe broach that topic with senior leadership, or what is there a way for that to happen in a healthy way?
I've seen, I have experienced it happening in a healthy way when I was at my previous church, but I also have talked with so many people where it was really frowned upon. And
Yeah.
typically, I am encountering people who are in contexts that are more on the Pentecostal charismatic side. And so their leadership is like, oh no, that's dead religion. You shouldn't be doing that. That's not, that doesn't have the Holy Spirit, you know. And I feel bad for folks that are getting that reaction. But I would also say, you can nourish yourself without having to convince or change the culture of your church. And you can test to see how long you could carry on that way. I mean, it's, this is a poor analogy, okay? Don't take this too far, the people who are listening to this. But, if you're working at McDonald's, that doesn't mean you have to eat McDonald's every day, You could go cook a nice salad and you could eat, and then you're showing up and so there's something about saying, or let's be a little bit more generous. You're working at Chipotle. That's great, but you shouldn't probably just only eat Chipotle every day. So I think for those who are in church ministry, go enrich yourself in a variety of ways. And I think there's two mistakes. The one mistake is to, again, criticize or condemn the tradition that you're working in because it's not, quote unquote, of satisfying your relationship with God. The other mistake is to say, well, now that I'm finding life in it, I've got to turn my whole church into that mode. And if I'm honest, if I reflect back on some of the years in my mid-30s, I think I was guilty of doing that on occasion. I wanted the whole church to kind of adopt this depth of liturgical practices or whatever. And I don't know if that was actually always the right pastoral decision. I was projecting the zeal of a convert. It was ministering to me, but it doesn't mean that was what was best for the whole church.
I don't know what the sociological term is, but there is something about when you discover something new, you can almost have this reaction that everybody else is wrong because you're so excited about what you're discovering. I remember when I went to college, I went to school in Minneapolis, and John Piper's church was 2 blocks from where I went to school. And I discovered Calvinism, Reformed theology for the first time in my life. This was over 20 years ago.
Yeah.
But at the time I was like, oh my gosh, this is the secret to unlock the meaning of the world. And it's easy to react to that and say everything else is wrong. And then you almost feel like you have to war against those who believe differently than you. And so that's really great advice, just to be able to say, let me take a deep breath. My tradition is not wrong. Sure, maybe there's some imbalances, but I can pursue a more holistic faith in some other ways.
Yeah. And I think, as church people who work in church, your exposure to that stream or pathway for connecting to God is like 10x the average person in your church, So just like, David, remember we used to tell worship leaders, you get tired of a song before the church does, right?
Right.
And it's the same way. You get tired of this pathway of spirituality faster than they will. That's okay. Just go diversify. And honestly, this principle applies to all kinds of things. I think if you're in a line of work that is output heavy, your input should be much, much deeper. And I don't just mean that you need to be reading more books. I just mean you need to be reading different kinds of books, right? So similarly, if your output is as a worship leader or as a pastor in a contemporary church, your input needs to be of a different quality, of a different degree. You need to be absorbing at a much more nuanced, a wider range of sources so that you can synthesize and survive and thrive in these other environments.
Yeah. Glenn, I love the introduction to your book. Not to discourage our listeners, make sure you read the entire book. But I feel like the introduction is so jam-packed with a lot of context surrounding why you wrote the book, right? So you juxtapose kind of the moral, therapeutic deism side of things and the Christian nationalist side of faith, which these are the things that are in the headlines a lot. Like this is people who are not in church see these expressions of Christianity and they judge the entire faith based upon that. And your book is a way of saying, not exactly, right? Let's step back and let's talk about what it actually means to be a Christian. But I wonder if you could answer this question, Glenn, like what is the role of church in culture?
Just a light question there, David.
Here we go.
Yeah, the subtitle of the book is Finding Our Way in an Age of Confusion and Corruption. And the corruption side of it is the way that culture kind of tends to co-opt the church. And yeah, moralistic therapeutic deism is one, and it's been, that was named by that sociologist Christian Smith 20 years ago or so, maybe 25 years ago, as kind of this idea of a distant God who wants us to behave and feel good. And then Christian nationalism is like, no, 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 God's desires for the church to sort of have dominion and take over and be central to the life of a nation. I think it is a complicated question of the church's relationship to culture, but I do, and lots of people have written on this and thought about this. But I think to say it in a maybe an overly simplistic way, look at the life of Jesus. Look at how Jesus in the Gospels relates to the world around him. The priority of his action is to his community of faith. In other words, to his followers. I'll give you a concrete example of this. The Sunday before the election last year, I wrote a prayer I was asked to write a prayer actually for churches in our Orange County to be able to use. And I was grateful that a number of churches used it. And I was grateful to have been asked to write it because it forced me to kind of think about how would we want people to pray. And the focus of the prayer was for the church in America, not for America. And I think that's an important distinction. So it was, Lord, help us to be salt, preserving what is good and preventing the rot. Help us to be light. In other words, putting goodness, justice, and righteousness on display. I'm spelling that out in the prayer. So there's something there. But again, the focus is this is for the church. And then at the end of the prayer is like, regardless of the outcome, the mission of the church remains the same. So Lord, help us to be faithful. And I think that's the first thing we got to believe. We got to believe that actually the church is God's vehicle of his kingdom arriving on earth as it is in heaven, not the machinery of the state. And if we get that wrong, then we're off on the wrong foot. So that's one of the first things we see about Jesus. The next thing you could go a layer down is you could go, all right, and what was Jesus's posture towards those around him? And this is where at the very end of the book, I name two things. I name a posture of healing and a posture of hospitality. And what I mean by this is Jesus is always welcoming people on the edges, but he didn't leave them as they were. He made them whole. So his welcome led to their wellness. And I think, David, honestly, in our cultural moment, we have churches and Christians who want to choose one or the other. So there's some that go, oh, let's go all in on the radical welcome, radical hospitality. We don't need to talk about sin. We don't need to confront. Let's just have people in. The other approach is let's go all in on naming where people are sick and broken, and we're going to become experts in everybody else's sin and mistakes, But whether or not they feel welcome, well, who cares? And I think the challenge of Jesus is that he's able to do both. He's able to welcome and make well the people who are close to him. And so if we trust that the church is God's vehicle for his kingdom to arrive in the world, then we go, and how did the king do this? King Jesus, the king brought the kingdom through hospitality and healing.
So we can pull from lessons from the seeker-sensitive movement.
Yeah.
And from, deeply liturgical, theologically driven church traditions, right? There's something to be found in the middle, in balance, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to quote you, Glenn. You say this: "The church has lost credibility because it has mishandled power. We have raised our voices for the wrong things and at the wrong times. We have taken a stand when we should have taken a knee in prayer and service. We have tried to rise up when we should have taken up our cross in sacrificial love. We believe in Jesus, but our lives look nothing like him." Dude, that's a mic drop statement right there. That's just so much conviction, so well said. Historically, Glenn, when did the church sort of shift from it's all about just believing the right things and not living like Jesus? Is there a time in history where that transition happened, or has it always been this way?
Well, I mean, throughout history, throughout the church's history, there's definitely been ups and downs with this. But I think in the American church, the most recent thing that I think a lot of people point to is that divide in the early 1900s. And what began to happen was the people who cared about a society kind of, post, I think it was post the stock market crash, 1928, the late 20s, early 30s. There were people who really wanted to emphasize the care for the poor. And that began to split out from the people who said, no, you actually have to believe in Jesus, and you actually have to believe that the Bible is the Word of God. And unfortunately, there's a guy named, I think it's Walter Rauschenbausch, if I'm probably butchering his name, that got labeled as the social gospel. And then the
Mhm.
other side got labeled as evangelicalism, and there's other names associated with that. So from there, 100 years ago, you kind of get the split where unfortunately each side reinforced the stereotypes about them, and the ones that were active about caring for the world, you could say acts of hospitality, if you will, um, went really squishy about doctrine. And over time, it just got worse and worse about, yeah, well, maybe the resurrection wasn't literal. And, on the other side, you had folks that went strong on know the cross in atonement and all this stuff, um, did not show up in the right ways in terms of caring for the poor. So they wanted to address the quote unquote sickness of sin, but they did not want to emphasize the welcome. Now, I'm speaking too broadly because the truth is, evangelicals have a great they also have a great legacy of organizations that have done both and. I think of World Relief and
Mm.
World Vision and Compassion, like this, all these orgs that link both and. So I think it is a caricature to say that these things got split, but maybe at the ground level for the the average churchgoer, in their minds, it was sort of like, yeah, it's about right belief, and or right living was about holiness or personal piety, but not about outward mercy and compassion. And maybe that's really the split, not so much between right belief and right living, but almost like personal private piety versus an outward mission. And I believe, the same era that brought us the Nicene Creed is an era that also gives us remarkable stories of the church caring for the sick and the poor, going through their own pandemics, so loving their enemies even after a season of persecution. So to me, those things are meant to go together, but sadly they haven't always.
It's almost like maybe this is not correct, but right belief is almost like the easy part. The hard part is whenever you actually live out what
Mm-hmm.
you believe, right? And
Mm-hmm.
just
Mm-hmm.
put that into action. Um, Glenn, as you've been preaching on the Nicene Creed and kind of preaching on the theme of this book, what has been the reaction just to people in your church, feedback that you've gotten? One of the things that you
Yeah.
said that really stuck out to me is you said our world has less of an intellectual problem with faith and more of an emotional one. I
Mm-hmm.
thought that really phrased our current times well, that it's less about the actual content of what we believe and more so the reaction to all of these
Mm-hmm.
other forms of faith. But what has been just your reaction in
Mm.
preaching and teaching this stuff?
I think the reaction, when we did it most recently here at Rock Harbor, it has been, wow, I didn't know that these words existed. And isn't it amazing what's not in there? That's what a couple of people said to me. I was like, yeah, it is amazing what's not in there. Now, again, the creed is not trying to be comprehensive, right? It's not trying to say all that it needs to be said. But what it is doing is it's giving us the irreducible minimum of what the Christian faith is about. And you know what the early Christians chose to focus on? Who God is. They basically chose, it's structured around Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So, when you said earlier, it's a little bit like a basic doctrine, kind of. But, a lot of times the basic doctrine books they deal in the abstract. Let's talk about the doctrine of humans, the doctrine, so it's concept, concept, concept. The creed is person, 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 first person, second person, third person of the Trinity. And so as a former worship leader, I think this is not a statement of faith. This is a call to worship. And yeah, there's ways the creed is a purifier. We talked about that, how it can purify the additives we've added. It can be a unifier to remind us of, like we've been talking about, how we can pull from different streams. But above all, it's a magnifier. It puts the spotlight on God and says, "Behold him." And I think that's been one of the most beautiful reactions from it is people go, "Wow, I never thought of the Father, the Creator, like this. So I never saw the beauty of the Son of God or the Holy Spirit." And so, anyway, yeah.
So good. Glenn, let's talk to worship leaders for a sec. I mean, you are a worship leader. You've I mean, when were you in the Desperation Band? I mean, that was like, was that like
Yeah.
late 90s?
Uh, no, it was like 2002 was the first album. And then
Okay.
I stepped out in 2008, 2009, something like that. I did 7 years. It was
Okay.
awesome. I mean, great memories for me. I always joke though, David, that when I stepped out, that's kind of when things really took off for the band. So, things got real good for those guys.
You were the bottleneck in the whole
That's
band,
right.
huh?
I was like Jonah, get this guy overboard.
Um, so many worship leaders, Glenn, and you'll feel this tension as we plan Sunday. Typically, the question it begins and ends with what songs are we going to sing,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Let's find just a list of great songs. However we do that, whether it's top
Hmm.
CCLI, what's popular, what other churches are doing. And I
Hmm.
feel like we're missing out on some more depth of worship practice and worship planning. And so I want to talk about this intersection. We're talking about the creed, right? And we're talking
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
the early church and theology. How can worship leaders move beyond just saying, what songs are we going to sing on Sunday? What are ways
Yeah.
that you're sort of
Yeah.
encouraging your worship leaders at Rock Harbor to maybe think a little bit more
Yeah.
broadly about this?
Well, first of all, I mean, Luke and Anna Hellebrandt are incredible worship leaders and seasoned, and they come in with the same instincts. So there's a couple layers to this. One is for worship leaders, think of this as a journey, first and foremost. So you're taking people on a journey. And so even the songs, not just about, ooh, I like this song, but it's how does this set up the next thing? And then, so there's a pilgrimage of sorts that's going on in that worship set. But then don't just think about the worship set, think about the service as a whole, as a journey. But maybe here's a different paradigm. Think of it as a story. What's the story this whole service is going to tell? So we have a meeting where, and this is common. A lot of churches do it, but we have a meeting where, the person who's hosting, the speaker, the worship leaders, everybody's in together, tech, and we're trying to go over the comms team, trying to make sure we are seeing the whole picture. But I think it's important to not just do that from a planning center perspective, like okay, let's make sure that the timing and the minutes. I listen. I care about that stuff, and that stuff is important. But let's make sure we're also saying, hey, what do we sense the Lord is wanting to do in our midst this weekend, and how do we facilitate that? How do we partner with God in that? And sometimes it's about subtraction, not addition. Sometimes it's like, what? Maybe we take out an announcement so that we can add a little bit of breath here. Or maybe it's we don't sing two songs at the end. We actually just have space, and then maybe we respond with one. So
Mm.
I think there's a couple ways to really think through this uh, cohesively. In the past, some of the mistakes I've experienced is when a worship leader thinks in too narrow of a way, and they think about their 20 minutes. And so they might go, oh, we want to go here, and then we want to go here. And I get up to preach, and I'm like, bro, the people are exhausted because you just took them on like you just gave them a roller coaster of emotions. And that's just like, it's frustrating for the speaker. On the other hand, I know preachers who think of their message as the main event. And so it's like, hey, yeah, hurry up already and let's get to the message. And neither are right. I mean, we try to strive at Rock Harbor for a view that this is the left pedal of the bike and the right pedal of the bike, and we're together. We move with what the Spirit is doing.
You have a unique vantage point, Glenn, because you've been a worship pastor and you've been a lead pastor. Typically, that relationship, there's a lot of strain there, or it goes up and down through different
Mm.
seasons of ministry life, right? Where a worship
Mm.
leader just doesn't understand their pastor. Like, you don't let me
Mm.
sing these songs, you don't give me enough time. And then a lead pastor kind of looks at their worship leader like they don't get it, and they sort of over micromanage or over
Mm.
program worship because they just don't trust what their worship leaders are going to say or do, right? What
Yeah.
advice would you have? I want this kind of a twofold question, but what advice would you give to the worship leader that's maybe struggling with their lead pastor,
Mm.
and sort of how to lead up in that situation? And what advice would you give to the lead pastor who's
Mm.
struggling with their
Mm.
worship leader?
It's great. I think for the worship leader, I will say, sitting in this chair now, and in some ways, at New Life downtown, I was in that lead chair in that context, in that congregation for 10 years. And then in a different way now, because at Rock Harbor, I'm thinking about boards and elders and budgets and giving and personnel and hire. There's a different scale. And
Yeah.
I would just say to the worship leader, your lead pastor is thinking about probably 10 times more things than you are. That not because he's better than you, not because she's whatever, but just by nature of the role. And where you're focused on one or two things on a Sunday, they're thinking about, oh, that person's on the brink of leaving. This person doesn't think I've said enough about justice. This person thinks I've said too much about justice. Whatever. And this person, wonders why I'm not using a physical Bible. So you just have to know that the lead pastor is carrying a whole lot of the pressure of everybody else's opinions, and that doesn't mean they have to bow to those opinions, but there's a weight that comes with the role that's hard to explain. So even if you don't understand it, at least allow for the empathy of it to go, you know what? There's some things I'm not seeing here, Don't assume that you're both looking at the same thing and just coming to different conclusions. I think there's a chance that the lead pastor is seeing some different things than you're seeing. Now, on the flip side, I think for the lead pastor, you have to ask yourself, do I want a worship pastor who's exactly like me? Or did I bring someone here to push us and to push our church in ways that I can't,
That's good.
And I think, ultimately that will determine the kind of relationship you have. If you want a worship pastor who's essentially just plug and play, like execute the game plan, that's okay. You should say that, though, because otherwise then the worship pastor would be frustrated if they're expecting collaboration and partnership and you're expecting, no, just execute, run the play. Um, but if you want a creative collaboration, this is more like in sports, like positionless basketball. You want the 5 highest IQ guys on the court. Let's just figure out what's happening here. We got a few actions we can run, and then let's go. Then you need, that is harder. And that's the model I try to operate out of, but that is harder. And there will be moments of tension, and there will be moments of friction. There will be moments where you're making different reads, to use that sports metaphor, where you're like, I thought I should cut here, and you're like, no, I wanted you to come and set the pick, and so that requires a lot more check-in, but ultimately has the potential to be a lot more rewarding, because you have two creative leaders trying to lead the church together, and you're trying to figure out what's best for the church.
Hmm. Glenn, a couple more questions. So for those that are, so I do staffing. I know you're familiar with Slingshot and Tim
Mm-hmm.
Foot and our whole
Mm-hmm.
crew. I work with Slingshot and do staffing. Um, this sort of world of hiring worship leaders and worship
Mm.
pastors, it's a
Mm.
big deal. It's a
Mm.
challenging landscape. Um, I feel like so often, and I just love to hear you unpack this tension. So often we are hiring for talent and primarily
Yeah.
like vocal ability. If someone is a great singer, then that sort of qualifies them primarily to be a great worship leader.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand that. I think
Sure.
there's a lot of pastors through the decades that have experienced really bad worship, and they're like,
Yeah.
never
Yeah.
again.
Never
You know what I
again.
mean?
Yeah.
And so,
Right.
but I want you to maybe unpack that tension where absolutely, like your singing ability is really important. But I
Mm.
almost feel like we've swung the pendulum so far that that's mostly what we care about. And
Mm-hmm.
so unpack that tension, and then as you think about what makes for a great worship pastor,
Mm-hmm.
what should lead pastors be valuing in that sort of analysis?
Well, let me start with a general frame. Everyone knows the I think it's the Willow Creek character, competency, chemistry. Those are great. Obviously, you need high character. The sing good, plays good thing is competency. Chemistry is how do they get along with the team. I think that's a given. I've started to add a few more to this list.
Okay.
So it's 7 C's. So we got the three. I think calling is a really important thing, and I don't just mean calling to local church ministry. I actually mean a sense of calling to this particular local church. I've started to recognize how important that is because if people come in and they don't actually love this church, there's going to be a problem. Like it's not
Mm,
enough to say, I love God, I love the presence of God, I love you. Okay. But, and I'm saying this, I'm reverse engineering it for me. Like, why has this gone so well for Holly and me and for Rock Harbor? Because the elders and the search team did such a good job of really drilling down. But do you love us? And are you called to us? And then right connected to that is culture. So do you really fit the culture of this church? So you might say, oh, yeah, God has called me, but actually I don't like the culture. I want to change the culture. No, we got to know, do you actually fit the culture of this church and this team? And then a sixth thing I would add is charism, and this is the this is the charismatic in me, but just in a general sense, spiritual gift.
mm,
So there are worship leaders who are shepherds, and their charism is they're going to really care for the team. That's awesome. Let's know that. There are worship leaders who their charism is the prophet, and be a they're going to be a provocation to the church. They're going to awaken the church. That's awesome. You should know that charism. There are worship leaders who are teachers. Who they're going to teach the church what worship's all about. Man, I love that. But let's know
mm,
what their charism is. Just because you're a worship leader doesn't mean you have the same charism. You do not. And then the final piece is the seventh C is clock. And this to me is also an under appreciated aspect of this because clock means where are you in the timeline of your development and maturity, and where are you in the timeline of what the church needs. So if the church is starting out, you're a church planter in year 3 and you're looking for a worship leader, you could go with a 22-year-old who's going to grow up with you. That's okay.
yep.
But man, if you're at a church that's rebuilding, say after a rough transition or like for us, I needed someone who was further along on their clock, like
Right.
their timeline of maturity level, and that's why Luke and Anna have been so amazing. Um, there's also sometimes this is the tricky one. You see this no doubt in the work that you do. Sometimes people are at the end of their clock, so to speak, and that's a trickier thing. You go, ooh, I don't know where this fits. So it is not cold. I think it's part of discernment to say, what season are you in? Are you in the season of seed sapling where these gifts and this skill level is just emerging and we need to really invest in developing you? Or are you in the season of, man, you're fruitful, but we probably got 3 years with you, maybe 4, 5, I think it's okay to discern all those things. So character, competency, and chemistry, but also calling, culture, charism, and clock.
Mm, that's so good. It's extra anointed when you have that kind of alliteration.
The 7 C's, baby. The
The
seven
seven
C's.
C's just takes root. Um, Glenn, are you noticing any just the influence of celebrity culture and performance in worship? Do you sense that that's
Mm,
something we need to watch out for in our churches?
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. To me, the line between celebrity and not has less to do with popularity and more to do with accessibility.
Hmm.
So you can't control if people start listening to you or people start streaming your song or whatever, or tuning in on the live stream. Like, okay, you know, you can't really control if the church starts to grow. I mean, and in some ways, wouldn't we want that? Like people to come to faith. So influence is not the problem. I think the problem happens when pastors or worship leaders remove their access from people. Now, I'm not saying you can be equally accessible to everyone. Of course not. But there's a line that people cross. It's like crossing the Rubicon, the line that you go too far is when you start to remove your access from all people in the church. And now you're not in a small group. Nobody in the church really knows you. You are on the stage, you're off the stage, you're in the green room, you're in your car, you go home. That's a problem, man. That's a problem. And I think when I think of celebrity culture, that's what I think of. I think of proximity. I think actually I didn't read her book, but I think Caitlin Beatty named it that way: proximity, power minus proximity, something like that. She has some equation for it, but that part
Yep.
of it, the proximity thing, really resonated with me. It's not about influence or popularity. It's automatically. It's about the lack of proximity and accessibility.
Yeah. And that's the book Celebrities for Jesus, right? Is that what you're
I think
referring to?
so. Again, I didn't read it. I'm not, but
Yep.
I think she had a good insight there.
Yeah. So many conversations that I'm having on this podcast, Glenn, are kind of related to the worship industry, and I would just love to get your take on
Mm.
it. You're such a balance. Everything you've said is so balanced. I feel like you think deeply about things and find this healthy middle ground. But I think a lot of
Mm.
worship leaders are sensing some of that tension, even of sort of the industrialization of
Yeah.
worship and how much it sells and how big this thing has gotten, but also the simple purity of what worship is. Is there anything that you're noticing that we just need to be careful about as it relates to those of us who are making worship music or those of us who are leading
Yeah.
worship songs? Like, talk to us about that tension.
I think, it's complicated, man. It really is because I know people on the label side who are really amazing people,
Yep.
and their intentions are to help more people experience God's presence and to help resource the church, and so that's really great. And on the flip side, if you're an artist that a label has invested in and said, "Hey, we're gonna put some money and some of our staff time towards distribution of this song and blah blah blah," it does not honor them or their work or their time to go, yeah, well, I don't really care, whatever. I'm not going to post about it. I'm not, And I say this not hypothetically, Dave. I mean, honestly, listen, for me, I'm in the author space, right? I'm in the
Yep.
author version of that now.
Right.
I thought it was humble to not really talk about my book and to kind of just go, oh, shucks, yeah, I wrote about whatever. And then I go, you know what? There's like 10 people at HarperCollins Christian who put their time and energy, who woke up on a Monday morning and said, I believe in this message. Let's try to get it out there. I'm
Mhm.
dishonoring them. How am I going to, as a pastor, stand up and tell people in my church, your work is holy and your work is matters in the marketplace? Meanwhile, I'm undercutting the work of the people in the publishing industry. So that's the other side of it that, like, okay, I want to honor the effort that people are putting into this by matching it with my own effort. So that's one layer. I think the other layer is about motive, and the only way to check that is you got to put yourself in positions where there's truth tellers in your life, and sometimes you have to pay to have truth tellers in your life. And what I mean is, see a spiritual director. I remember years ago we first started this congregation, and I sat in the lead pastor chair of that congregation in Colorado, downtown Colorado Springs. I was like, whoa, this is a weird feeling. I want to start seeing a spiritual director. I
Mm.
saw him monthly for a few years, then it went quarterly. Now my version of it here is I have a leadership coach who also will challenge me on some of these things. And you have to have trustworthy community like we talked about with accessibility and all that. So there's truth tellers in the organic form and there's truth tellers in the paid form, but you got to have that. And too many people because it's easy to lose your point of reference. It's easy to lose perspective. And over time, your only friends are people in the industry, and your only friends are doing the same thing as you are. And so then you're each other's reference point, and you just lose touch. And so you're making decisions about money, and you're making decisions about ticket prices, and and all of a sudden it's like, what's going on?
Yep.
So that's there. And then I think people who've been burned from this would say, try to make as many pre-game decisions as you can. You know, it's not unlike what I would say, what Andy Crouch would say to a young business person: pre-decide what you're going to live off of, and if you make more than that, give it away, invest it, be generous, save it.
Yep.
Similarly, pre-decide how much influence is enough, or how much whatever is enough, and then decide what are you going to do with it. So the difference for a Christian with power is not that we should shun power. The difference for a Christian is how we use power, how we steward power. Jesus in John 13, it says, when he knew that the Father had put all things in his hand and had given the disciples over to him, or entrusted them to his care, took off his robe and began to wash their feet. Jesus doesn't say, no, 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 Father, I don't want to be entrusted with this many people's lives. He says, okay, I'm going to wash their feet. And I think that's the attitude. And the people who are the best at it, the most refreshing worship leaders who are quote unquote in the industry, are the ones who, and I know, I talk to a lot of them, and some of them live out here, and some of them go to our church, and
Right.
they say, I'm just trying to wash people's feet when I get on the stage every night. And I go, you know what? I love that. Keep that heart.
Yeah. No, that's so good. Glenn, what's one book or two or three that you're reading right now or have read in the last couple months that you're loving?
You know, a couple months ago, I finished John Ortberg's new book, Steps, and I really loved it. It's a reflection of spiritual formation through the lens of the 12-step program, recovery, and it's great because I was forced to admit, like, oh yeah, I'm addicted to people's praise or whatever, and John is so vulnerable in the book, so it's a wonderful devotional slash challenging read. On the fun side, I'm almost done with the book on Netflix, No Rules Rules, and absolutely loving it just from an organizational leadership perspective, how to lead creative people. Super inspiring. I think there's things there that you'll strain out and go, nah, that doesn't apply. And then there's other things that you go, that's really interesting.
Yep. No, I find that in my own personal reading, the surprising intersections of unrelated fields or genres,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
I think
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot to learn there. So if you're a worship leader, don't just read worship books.
Yes.
Read some fiction, read some
Yes.
theology, read Glenn's book, What's a Christian
Yes.
Anyway, you know?
Yes.
But but seriously,
Thank
like
you.
the being kind of the broad perspective, I think helps us
Mm.
in our work.
Yeah.
Um, Amazing. Glenn, this was so fun. The book is What's a Christian Anyway? And I just want to say this because as I've been reading the book, I was thinking this is great for somebody who's not a believer that's just
Mm-hmm.
curious about faith. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also really great for those of us maybe that have been a believer for most of our lives.
Yeah.
A way to sort of reorient our hearts back to what it really means to be a Christian. That's what it's
Yeah.
kind of doing for me is it's just this
Mm.
sort of like breath of fresh air
Mm.
that so often we can put so many different things upon our faith and Christianity, but this is kind of the essence of
Mm.
who we are as the people of God, followers of Jesus. So
Love it.
thanks for writing it, Glenn, and thanks for
Oh,
your
that's
time
very
today.
kind. That's very kind, David. Thank you so much. And look, if people want to read it like with their worship teams or in small groups, there's a website, what'sachristiananyway.com, what'sachristiananyway.com, where you can get a small group discussion guides for free. Look, if your pastor wants to preach a series on it, I'm giving away all of my sermon notes for a 7-week series on this. In fact, I know a few pastors who are doing this right now at post Easter, and so it's a great, easy 7-week series that giving away my notes, giving away discussion guides, and bulk purchases. You can get it 40% off if you want to do that. So my hope is really just to resource you to help lead your people well. And I think I just have such a burden for people who are so disillusioned with the church, they want to throw it all away. And my hope is, man, cling to Jesus in the midst of all of this.
Yeah. Amen. This is a great website. I didn't even know this existed. Look at this. What'sachristiananyway.com. Yeah, this is great. Thank you, Glenn. Appreciate you.
Thanks, David.